Thank you, Doc, and good evening, everybody. I'd like to speak tonight about my family, my profession in diplomacy, and about my rather circuitous faith journey, which has brought me here to Spiedel. Here we go. My family of origin is, on my father's side, was Jewish. The photo on the left is of my grandparents, Mary and Louis Kosnett. Although my grandfather was born Louis Kirsteniecki in Moldova back in the days of the Russian Empire, not even the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire. He moved to the United States in 1919 and met my grandmother, Mary, who moved to the United States from Białystok, Poland. And they both came to America for the same reason that millions of other immigrants have, to escape from violence in their homelands, and in their case, anti-Semitic pogroms, and also to seek opportunity to live the American dream. The center photo is of Louis and Mary decades later at the marriage of their youngest child. And the third photo is of my grandfather with my 5 cousins. I was the baby, I had not been born yet. And you can imagine how happy he was at that moment. And the next generation also lived the American dream. On the left, you see my cousin Erwin, my father Larry with his shirt off. My dad liked to show off a little bit. When they had come back from their first round of Army service at the tail end of World War II. My father went on to the University of Michigan on the GI Bill, that's his college yearbook photo, and was commissioned in the US Army as a lieutenant of infantry just in time to go to Korea and fight in the trenches against the Chinese. But as I was growing up, I would beg my father to tell war stories, and the stories he liked to tell were not stories of bloody combat. They were stories of opportunities he had to help the Korean people. He even had a story he liked to tell about saving the life of a Chinese prisoner. Those were the stories that mattered to him, and that stuck with me. And in the 1950s, my father went on to live the American dream. He became an insurance executive. He married a beautiful woman. That's my mother, Barbara Hain. An Irish Catholic girl. It was a mixed marriage, which in New Jersey in the 1950s was living on the edge. They had a couple of kids. That's me and my older brother, Jeff. And when I think of my father's life, I always remember the words of the famous North Carolina philosopher James Taylor, who said that the secret of life is enjoying the passage of time. My parents' marriage endured for a while. It did not last forever. And sometime later, my father met the love of his life, Maria Helena Augusto Catano, a Brazilian lady, my stepmother. And they lived for many years very happily in California, in Florida, and eventually retiring to Brazil. Now, my father had not really wanted to be an insurance executive. He had wanted to either be a career Army officer or an English professor. But in the 1950s in New Jersey, there was a lot of pressure, on a young Jewish man to, get a job where he'd wear a necktie and move up the ladder. So in his final decades living in Brazil, he did become an English teacher, which really was living the dream. The photos on the bottom are from my father's interment ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. And you can see in the photo, I would understand if you thought this was a still photo from The Sopranos, but this is not a mafia family. These are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Mary and Louis Kosnett. Doctors, lawyers, journalists, couple of diplomats, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, and their partners. I think that Mary and Louis would be very proud of what their family has been able to achieve in America. Okay, this is me. I was a cute little guy. I had a pretty normal high school and college life, except that because I guess I'd gotten this from my father. I developed this interest in military history, and when I was in high school, I wrote magazine articles for military history magazines. I wrote a book chapter. I designed historical simulation games, very geeky kind of hobby, but a strong interest in the military, which evolved into an interest in conflict resolution and diplomacy. And so after I got out of college, I joined the State Department, and amazingly, stayed for 38 years. I didn't expect that when I joined, but most of my adult life, I was an American diplomat working overseas, promoting American interests, protecting American lives, and projecting American values, as we say. It was an extraordinary life. Had a couple of early assignments, got married, had a son, Alex, a daughter, Nicole. And that marriage lasted a while, and then that also ended in divorce. And this is all part of God's plan, because God introduced me a couple of years later to the extraordinary Allison Smith, whom some of you know as Eunice Elliott's daughter. And Allison grew up in this church. We got married in 2000 and lived an amazing life for decades to come, living in 8 different countries, serving the American people. And that's Alex and Nikki all grown up with us. Our first assignment was to the Netherlands in 2000. And here is where the story of my family and my professional life intersects with my faith journey. As I mentioned earlier, my father's family's roots were Jewish. My father was not a religious man. I grew up surrounded by my Jewish relatives, kind of steeped in Jewish history and culture and pride in achievement, pride in education. I don't want to suggest that my mother's family was not an influence on me, but they were geographically scattered, and so I was much more likely, to be spending Friday night at my cousin's house, eating Jewish food, than I was to be in contact with my mother's family for the most part. So I grew up thinking of myself as Jewish, but I will say I was not religious. In fact, I will acknowledge that, if you had met me in college, you would have found me a really acerbic, skeptical atheist, not even an agnostic, and I could be pretty obnoxious about it. That's why it amazed everyone in my family and all of my friends from earlier in my life when in 2002 I was baptized in the Netherlands at the American Protestant Church of The Hague. Allison and I started attending this church shortly after we got to the Netherlands in 2000. And a lot of people assume that I kind of went through the motions of calling myself a Christian because I had married this wonderful Christian woman, but I describe it differently. I think I recognized the depth of my wife's faith and the importance of Christianity to her. And for the first time in my adult life, I really felt like, okay, I should really look at this, And we started attending Bible study. I did a lot of self-study on my own. From a very analytical perspective, reading the Old Testament and looking at how, Jesus really does seem to be the Messiah. This really all kind of holds together. And I think after 9/11, another element in my mind was that I really felt the presence of good and evil in the world. So in 2002, I was baptized by a couple of dear friends, the Methodist pastors who ran APCH. And once again, if I'm being fully honest, I will tell you, I don't think I was 100% sold on this Christianity stuff at that point. I was probably 90% sold, but I had some doubts. Then a couple of years later, I found myself in Iraq, leading a mixed civilian military team in the province of Najaf. I will not tell you a long, long story about this. We were there to try to build democracy, rebuild the economy after the war. A lot of Iraqis wanted us there, a lot of Iraqis did not. And soon after I arrived, there was an uprising among the Shiites in southern Iraq, and my team found itself we found ourselves besieged on our compound with a handful of soldiers to help defend us against hundreds of Shiite militiamen. The U.S. Army offered to fly us out. I declined, and this sounds really corny, but I declined because I did not want to pull down the American flag. I thought it would send the wrong message to our Iraqi allies if we were to withdraw under pressure like that. So I stayed, and I told my team, everyone's free to go. Almost everybody decided to stay because, the boss was staying and nobody wanted to look like a coward, so they stayed with me. I was very sensitive to the fact that people were risking their lives because of a decision that I had made. And those among you who have military experience may know that, it's a common thing in the military, but it was certainly not something I'd ever planned for or trained for. We had been sleeping in trailers outdoors. We moved into our headquarters building to be under concrete cover because we're getting rocketed and mortared and shelled every night, and this went on for a couple of months. And one night when the shelling was particularly heavy, I found myself praying. And anyone here who has ever seen the movie The Right Stuff or read the book The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe might remember about the original Mercury astronauts, might remember Alan Shepard's prayer, which was, "Dear God, let me not screw this up." And what that meant to me at that moment was, don't let me get my guys killed, because they are only here because I made a decision to stay. And was it my ego talking? Did I think we were really going to be able to perform a mission under these circumstances? And that night, in the middle of the night, when we were getting shelled, I heard the literal voice of God in my head, in my ear. And God was saying, don't worry. Nobody on your team is going to get killed in Iraq. You are all going to live through this. And I shared that with the people around me. And one or two of my team were believers, and they started praying with me. Everybody else started looking around for handcuffs and zip ties because they thought, the old man had lost it. But we got through it, and everybody on my team survived. God did not lie. And more than a decade later, Allison and I went to Turkey. I was assigned as the deputy ambassador at the U.S. Embassy. After a year, I became the acting ambassador for another year. And 2 weeks after we arrived in Turkey, there was an attempted coup against the government of Turkey. Long story. The Turkish government thought the Americans were behind it, or at least that we knew something about it. And they started to arrest American citizens on just absolutely ridiculous, phony charges to put pressure on us to extradite some people they thought were responsible for the coup who lived in the States. That was never going to work. Among the people that they took hostage, the ones who became best known were Andrew and Noreen Brunson, who were missionaries from North Carolina who ran a small storefront church in the city of Izmir. And they'd been there for 18 years, and a lot of people didn't really like that this church existed. So, after the coup, they were arrested. I first heard about this as the chief operating officer at the embassy, not from my staff, not from the Turkish government, but through a Facebook Messenger message from a friend of mine in North Carolina, because incredibly, the home church of the Brunsons was this church in the mountains of North Carolina that Allison and I attended because we maintained a vacation home there near Ridgecrest. Wonderful bargain, by the way. Y'all should go to Ridgecrest. And at that very moment, when I was trying to grapple with this, what are the odds that, Noreen and Andrew have been arrested, and I'm from their same church. Allison was saying, this is it. This is why God set you on this path. This is why you are a diplomat. This is why we are in Turkey. is to help these people. Andrew wrote a wonderful book, God's Hostage, which I recommend to everybody. The embassy, the State Department, the White House, congregations around the world spent 2 years working to get Andrew out. We got Noreen out in a couple of weeks, but it took 2 years to get Andrew Brunson released from prison, from this ordeal. And shortly thereafter, Allison and I, we wrapped up our tour, and we were back in North Carolina praying alongside, Andrew and Noreen at our own church. And when I think back on these events in Iraq, these events in Turkey, I know that even though, when I was young, I had no idea about it, I was very skeptical about it, God had a plan. He always had a plan. And I want to close with 3 things. One is, when I did become baptized and announced this to friends and family, one of my college friends who had been born again said, "Wow, if Phil Kosnett can become a Christian, there's hope for everybody." And then I want to leave you with these two verses that have meant a great deal to me in life. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future," from Jeremiah. And then from Joshua, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Thank you for your attention.
How great was that? Thank you. What a wonderful story and presentation. Gosh. I want to hear more from him. Y'all know enough of my story. I want him to come back and fill in some of the blanks. That was terrific. Thank you. So 2019, my friend Barry Howard wrote a book about people's call stories, not so cleverly titled Call Stories. Barry was pastor of First Baptist Pensacola, took a couple of years off where he did some interims and some writing and some consulting before he came to Wyuka. So he's our neighbor here. But during that time, he decided that the Baptist family was not doing as good a job as we're trying to do telling our stories. So he recruited a number of us to write a chapter for this book in Call Stories. In addition to my chapter, there are some other names you will recognize. Matt Duvall, Chris George, who's at Smoke Rise here in town, Barry Howard, David Hull, Jane Hull, Bill Hull, and David and Jane's daughter, Emily Hull McGee, all have chapters in this book. David and Matt Sapp have chapters. Joel Snyder, who was our guest recently on a Wednesday night, and Bill Wilson, who was our consultant several years ago. This is in our church library if you want to hear or read their stories. For my time tonight, I'm going to do this in 3 parts. I want to read you my chapter, which is about 12 or 13 minutes because I read it to myself and timed myself today. But it was published in 2019. The story doesn't end there. The other 2 parts of my presentation are, I want to tell you the call story that led me to Second-Ponce 11 years ago, and the call story that Melissa and I have just recently been through, so that there will be some context for that as well. My chapter is titled, Called Because I Could Not Sing. Let's get Doc to do a devotional. Yep, my call story started because I can't sing. I was part of a small youth group at the First Baptist Church of Doraville, Georgia. It was in the era of Sunday night church. And my youth group put together a small vocal ensemble, 6 voices, I think, and the group performed at other Baptist churches on Sunday nights. My sister, my girlfriend, and some of my best buddies memorized the words to about 10 songs, wore ugly ecru dresses or the matching tie, and traveled around Atlanta. My youth minister, Bert Ross, in pity for the most musically challenged youth, said, "Let's get Doc to do a devotional." The group agreed. On a long series of Sunday nights, Morning Mist performed, and I closed out the service with a heartfelt and poorly written devotional, the exact same words every night. It was bad, but still I was affirmed by people I admired for having some gifts for public speaking. During my senior year of high school, I began fielding the ever-present conversation starter. "So, Doc, where are you going to college and what are you planning to major in?" Based solely on a great youth experience and the adult affirmation of my 6-minute devotional, I announced that I wanted to pursue vocational ministry. The crowds cheered. All of the important adults in my life celebrated and affirmed me. And one Sunday, I went down front at the First Baptist Church and told my pastor, Bill Doverspike, that I was surrendering to full-time Christian ministry. That's what we said back then. I was never under assault and was getting all kinds of support for my noble vocational choice, but for some reason I was told that I was surrendering to the ministry. I asked my Episcopalian high school counselor, Charles Gardner, about my college choices. He said if I were a Baptist and preparing for ministry, I'd go to Mercer University in Macon. I'd never heard of Mercer, but his endorsement was enough. I told my parents about my college hopes, and they gulped hard since private school tuition was not in the plans. As a gift of God's providence, my mother took a job on the Mercer Atlanta campus that allowed me to attend the university in Macon tuition-free. The First Baptist Church of Doraville was a warm, affirming, blue-collar church populated mostly by employees of the nearby General Motors plant. That congregation loved me and nurtured my calling. I preached on Youth Sunday and even filled the pulpit a few Sunday nights. I shudder to think what I inflicted on those saints. Still, they loved me and encouraged me. But First Baptist's best gift to me was an introduction to Melissa Brown. She was stunning and out of my league, even when wearing the Morning Mist ecru polyester dress. We began dating in the spring of my senior year of high school. When I went to Mercer, Melissa was still in Atlanta, and our long-distance courtship involved several conversations about what a life of shared ministry might look like. To my great delight, she was ready to take the journey with me, and we've been ministering together ever since. In the year since I had declared my call to vocational ministry and before beginning Mercer, my call story was smooth and encouraging, the stuff of a Hallmark after-school special. But my first year at Mercer was when the vocational crisis hit. Like every ministerial student, I immediately got involved in the Baptist Student Union, BSU, and I was also part of a subgroup of the BSU, the Ministerial Association. Believe it or not, there were enough of us preparing for vocational ministry that we had a robust club with programs and speakers. My freshman year, I also pledged the Sigma Nu fraternity. The tension between my involvement in BSU and the fraternity was the spark that ignited my crisis of vocation. I loved hanging out with my fraternity friends. My best friends at school were part of Sigma Nu. We played intramural sports together, ordered late-night Domino's pizza, talked honestly about girls, upcoming exams, and life choices. Fraternity friends affirmed my calling and later voted for me to serve as Sigma Nu chaplain. On the other hand, the Ministerial Association was not nearly as welcoming. They challenged my participation in a social fraternity. One officer of the group, whom I barely knew, confronted me at a meeting and said, "You know that part of your dues goes to buy beer, don't you?" The guys in the ministerial association, yes, in those days it was all guys, seemed pious and plastic in ways I was not, and I could not see becoming like one of them. They brought briefcases to class, carried Bibles to algebra, and distanced themselves from the rest of college life. My broader college involvement made me suspect to them, and I was never fully part of their group. Not fitting with the other ministerial students caused me to doubt my calling. I assumed that a call to ministry meant a call to be one of them. I assumed that I had misunderstood what I thought to be God's call on my life. I thought my only options were to become like the others preparing for ministry or change my vocational choice. I struggled. I prayed. I howled at the moon. I walked the campus with friends and talked and anguished. Everybody at home, at church, they're going to be so disappointed in me, I thought. I anguished some more. Finally, I realized I just could not see myself as an honest part of the ministerial association, and it was time for me to give up on ministry. I made an appointment to see my academic advisor, Dr. Howard Giddens. He had been pastor of First Baptist Church in Athens, Georgia for 18 years before teaching Old Testament at Mercer. My very first college course at 8 o'clock Monday morning was Introduction to Old Testament with Howard Giddens, and I liked and trusted him. The afternoon of my appointment, I walked down a quiet linoleum hallway to his office in Knight Hall. I was there simply to tell my advisor that I wanted to change my major and to complete the needed paperwork. But as I began explaining, I started to cry. Embarrassed by my emotion, I started slobbering and blurting incomplete sentences about how I didn't want to be a pastor. I didn't want to be all plastic and phony. I wasn't going to turn my back on my fraternity friends, how I couldn't be as pious as a minister had to be. And when I finished my tirade, Dr. Giddens spoke slowly. "Boy, there's hope for you. The only way to make it in ministry is for a real calling to get integrated with a real life. Nobody can fake it for the long haul. All the good ones have struggled with this integration. I'm not going to give you the forms to change your major today. Instead, I want you to meet with me for the next several weeks at this time, and let's talk. If my instincts are right, you are just beginning to do the hard work that all the good ones must do." Howard Giddens saved me. I never did change my Christianity major. Parenthetically, since I knew my roommate's student number, I did, however, find the forms and declared a new major for him. I think Jeff Porter spent a year as a women and gender studies major before he found out. Clearly, God had more work to do in my life. Instead of changing my major, I enrolled in all the Bible and ministry classes I could get my hands on. I loved what I was studying, and I trusted and even embraced the struggle of trying to figure out how a holy God could endorse and shape a guy like me for ministry. I graduated with my Christianity major in June of 1984. Melissa and I got married in our church in Dorville in July, and we loaded my lime green 1972 Ford Pinto and moved to seminary in August. While a student at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, my calling deepened. I found ministerial students whom I liked and admired. I found professors who challenged my narrow but sure thinking. I found new gifts for ministry and continued affirmation that I was unpacking an authentic call to serve God's church. While I was a student, I served the Warrenton Baptist Church in Warrenton, North Carolina, as the minister of everything else. The pastor, Ed Bedingfield, and I were the only two staff members, and I was part-time. But this loving community let me try my hand at leadership and loving and planning trips and ordering curriculum and spaghetti supper fundraisers. I loved my youth group. I went to their ball games and graduations, and they let me into their lives. Ed was a pipe-smoking Yale Divinity graduate with a beard and a Volvo. I'd never met a pastor like Ed. And I watched him preach and love and serve with effective delight. As the church followed Ed's love for them and gave me space to fumble and try, I began to claim that God really could call and shape a variety of people into effective ministry. If God could use this New Haven liberal this effectively, maybe I had a chance. The Warrenton Baptist Church initiated my ordination process, and I called Bill Doverspike back in Doraville and asked him if he would lead the process and let me come home and be ordained by the church that first saw some glimmer of God's call. The certificate hangs on my office wall with 12 now faded signatures. I look back at it from time to time with gratitude for the risk they took and for the churches that made my formation part of their ministry. I suppose if I'd been able to sing, I might have been given an ecru polyester tie, and this story would have turned out differently. But I'm grateful for the turns that led me down the path of ministry. Grateful for God's tenacious providence, still trying to shape me into the minister I was called to be. And I'm grateful for the churches and individuals who loved me into this amazing work for the kingdom of God. My chapter of call. I'm obviously emotional, so the next two parts are going to be tough. I want to tell you some of the story of my call here. 18 years I was at the School of Theology at Mercer University. I had 3 roles there. I was the admissions director, the founding first admissions director of the school when we opened in the fall of 1996. After, 9 years, I think, in that role, I, for 5 years, gave leadership to a $2 million Lilly grant that dealt with the transition into ministry. And Jonathan Barlow was a part of that program. He was doing a residency here at Second-Ponce while I was leading the program at McAfee. 5 years in that role, and I finished my doctoral work and moved to the classroom teaching leadership and supervised ministry. I loved my 18 years at Mercer, loved it, and had no intentions of leaving. I really thought I would retire teaching at the School of Theology. But during that time, I did 10 interim pastorates. So I have been voted out of nearly every good church in Atlanta at some point. And came to Second-Ponce as the interim pastor. It was interim number 10, and I had every intention of serving my year here and leaving and going back to the classroom. And this felt different. Pretty quickly, this one felt different. And some of the other interims approached me about staying. None of that felt right to me. Second-Ponce felt different. And early into my time here, I said to Melissa, this feels different. And if they ask me to stay, we need to talk about this. And so we were talking and praying about this decision for a long time before it became any sense of reality. And one day I got a call from, who was it? John, do you remember who called? It was, that's right. It was Alex McDonald, that's right. I don't want to put the blame on John. John chaired the committee that called me. I'm outing him to some of you. But Alex McDonald on the committee called and said, "We have narrowed the search to 3 names we would like to interview, and you are one of them. Would you agree to interview?" And I said, "Yes." And there was this long pause. And he said, "You want some time to think about that, pray about it, talk to Melissa?" And I said, "I did that already." And I knew that if this call came, I was saying yes. And what has been one of God's great gifts to me is the committee affirmed my candidacy, and almost 11 years ago, September 1st would be 11 years, I became senior pastor of Second-Ponce. Every day of that felt providential and right, though some of those days were really, really hard. I've had some hard seasons in this role, but never a season that I thought I was not called to be at this place. Everything affirmed what I thought was God's direction. And I have served with real delight this decade and longer. So I'll go to story number 3. Over the course of these 10 years, I have had a few phone calls of committee chairs who have said, "Would you consider talking to our search committee?" I never once sent anybody a resume. I never once looked to leave here. I had every intention of retiring as pastor of Second-Ponce. I said to all of those committee chairs, "Thank you very much. I'm quite honored and flattered, but no, I love where I am." And then a year ago or so, a friend called and said, I need to ask you if I can submit your name to a search committee." And I said, "Thank you, but no." He said, "Hear me out. I am convinced that this is perfect for you. The chapel at Big Canoe in the North Georgia mountains identifies people in your age bracket, grown children, 60 years old, who are like them, to come serve the last decade or so of their ministry with them. And in all ways, you seem to be a fit for this, and I wish you would consider it." So I came home and talked to Melissa, and it was the first time in 11 years we said, "This feels right for our season of life." We're both in our 60s. We knew we would not retire in a townhome in Buckhead. We hadn't talked about what retirement would look like. We just knew we wanted to be close to the kids, and this is close to the kids. It's within an hour and 15 minutes of both of them in a pretty idyllic retirement kind of setting that is not a move to retirement, but it's a step to retirement, and a step that would probably extend my ministry. I have been going at a pace here that, and looking at retiring at 65 and just collapsing at the finish line. And this, I think, allows me to extend that ministry, adopting a different kind of pace. So we agreed to have that conversation and felt the same kind of resolution and peace about the fit of this place for our gifts and for this season of life. But another factor in this for me has been where Second-Ponce is in her season. The church needs a dynamic new start, an evangelistic energy, a visionary growth that are skill sets I simply don't have. I'm not being self-depreciating. That kind of institution building is not a primary strength of mine. It's what Second-Ponce needs right now. And so part of what's affirmed this step of the calling for me is I do think Second-Ponce is ready for a new season of growth and ministry and renewal. Even as I think my pastoral skills fit well into a slower pastoral context of chaplaincy. And so we followed through that process, and their discernment and our discernment led to the same place. But it's not that we're leaving Second-Ponce. We love this place. And it's born in part because of our love of this place. And so we are saying yes to the next chapter in our call story. It feels providential and right to us, but right now we're also in a season of great grief and sadness because you all mean so much. And so we're having a hard time pulling away, even as we're trying to cheer on the next chapter of ministry for this place. So I will hope that my friend Barry Howard does a second edition so I can include in my next chapter my affection for you and for the 10 years I've had here. Amen. Go in peace.